Thank you very much, Walter, for a very sobering and yet encouraging perspective. We'll have an opportunity to discuss this perspective and some of these opportunities during the panel discussion. It's important to acknowledge that enormous progress has been made since 1998 in at least recognizing and responding in some cases, in some places, to the issue of internal displacement. But still, the policy successes that we've seen over the past years have largely been outweighed by the failure to prevent new displacement from occurring and to reduce the significant numbers of IDPs across the world. So our latest report is a testimony to this. I'll ask you to remember first that the numbers that we present today are our best estimates of a very complex phenomenon that in many places remains extremely difficult to monitor, yet alone to measure. Let's not forget that behind these statistics are real people, women, men, and children who fled danger and left behind their homes, their loved ones, and their belongings, often for months, years, and even in some cases, permanently. There were 30.6 million new internal displacements by conflict and disasters in 143 countries in the world last year. Most conflict displacement took place in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. Disaster displacement was concentrated predominantly in East Asia and the Pacific, South Asia, and the Americas. This year, our global report gives a breakdown of displacement by region and reflects this uneven distribution across the world, with sub-Saharan Africa representing 46% of the global total for conflict displacement, and East Asia and the Pacific 45% of the global total of disaster displacement. The 10 worst affected countries, China, the Philippines, Syria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Cuba, the United States, India, Iraq, Somalia, and Ethiopia, accounted for more than 1 million new displacements each. The number of new displacements by conflict and violence almost doubled, from 6.9 million in 2016 to 11.8 million in 2017. Now, this is the highest figure that we've recorded in over a decade. Syria, DRC, and Iraq together accounted for more than half of the global figure. In Syria and Iraq, the fight against the Islamic State caused much of the new displacement we recorded. The battle to retake the Iraqi city of Mosul led to more than 800,000 displacements, while in Syria, the SDF drove ISIL out of Raqqa, which caused the displacement of the city's entire population of 230,000. Syrian government forces also retook Deir ez-Zor, as well as southern Idlib, northern Hama, and Aleppo, causing more than 1 million new displacements in the process. An unprecedented number of returns were also recorded in Syria during the year. More than 800,000 IDPs and about 56,000 refugees were said to have made their way back to their places of origin during the year. But the bulk of these returns have been to places still hosting large numbers of IDPs. In the DRC, almost 2.2 million new displacements were recorded, more than twice the number of new displacements in 2016, and more than the next 3 worst affected countries in the region combined. The already dire humanitarian situation in the country deteriorated further last year and prompted the UN to declare a level 3 emergency there. Food insecurity in the country is currently at its highest level on record, particularly in the Kasai region, with 2 million children at risk of severe malnutrition. Of note last year was that Yemen dropped off the top 10 list of countries with highest levels of new internal displacement. Now, this does not mean that the situation on the ground has improved, quite the contrary. Rather, it illustrates the many difficulties that we and our partners have in accessing people in remote areas with a complete breakdown in services and producing reliable data on their numbers, their locations, and their needs. We know that amidst one of the worst humanitarian crises, with continual aerial bombings and high levels of destruction, displacement persists across Yemen and is not likely to end anytime soon. So even though the country doesn't feature prominently on our global map, the situation there deserves to be kept high on the international agenda. 18.8 million new internal displacements by disasters were also recorded last year. Of the total, more than half was triggered by only 10 disaster events, caused by weather-related hazards for the most part, mainly tropical cyclones in floods in East Asia and the Pacific, the Americas, and South Asia. The Atlantic hurricane season was the most active since 2005. In a one-month period, the three major hurricanes, Harvey, Irma, and Maria, displaced around 3 million people. They hit the Caribbean just as the region was still recovering from the devastation caused by Hurricane Matthew, which IDMC reported last year as having already displaced 2.2 million people. While the impacts of the hurricanes were felt across the US and the Caribbean, not all the people displaced were affected in the same way. Coping capacities and recovery rates varied hugely, mostly as a function of GDP and overall income levels. The displacement that took place in Dominica was the highest in the world relative to population size. Close to half the island's population was displaced. Progress towards durable solution will be heavily dependent on insurance penetration and coverage and current humanitarian assistance and recovery efforts. In Puerto Rico, 86,000 new displacements were triggered by Hurricane Maria. The losses have been estimated at around 73% of the island's GDP, and the poverty rate is thought to have increased by 10% as a result. So with significant internal displacement and onward trajectories into the US, some estimates suggest that the island could lose up to 14% of its entire population by 2019 as a result of Maria's impacts. Beyond the Americas, tropical cyclones also affected East Asia and the Pacific and South Asia. The impacts of the monsoon season were significant in South Asia, a region of high exposure and vulnerability, driven by inequality and unsustainable development, and with national and local authorities struggling to provide aid to the millions of people in need. In India, 1.8 million new displacements were recorded across 8 states, while in Bangladesh, the monsoon season flooded up to a third of the country for several weeks and displaced 436,000 people. For the first time this year, we were able to obtain data and information on displacement by drought in 4 countries: Somalia, Ethiopia, Burundi, and Madagascar. 1.3 million internal displacements in total were recorded, which already represents a staggering 7% of the global number of new displacements by disasters. Now, a combination of drought and lack of livelihoods led to over 1.2 million people leaving their homes in Somalia alone. We know, however, that the global picture of drought displacement could be much worse than what we can currently measure, when we consider that drought was also recorded last year in Angola, Chad, China, Mauritania, Niger, and North Korea, but for which there's no displacement data available right now. Alongside these high and sometimes shocking figures, we've also documented some more encouraging examples of responses to disaster displacement in the world. The responses by the governments of Indonesia and Vanuatu, for example, to volcanic activity in 2017 show that effective early warning systems can reduce people's exposure to hazards. Another example comes from Vietnam, where during 2017, 10 disaster events caused 663,000 new displacements. Most of this displacement was in the form of preemptive evacuations. The efforts of the Vietnamese government to provide low-income groups with flood and storm-resilient housing and of promoting community-based approaches to disaster risk management must be recognized and encouraged. What these examples do is that they illustrate that displacement does not always have to be a negative outcome, in that preemptive evacuations save lives and are an effective resilience measure. This also shows that a better measurement of risk and an improved understanding of where and how displacement might happen in the future is critical for developing more comprehensive and integrated approaches to this phenomenon and resourcing them adequately from the local to the international level. Also key to improving responses is the need to monitor disaster-related displacement situations over time, beyond the initial trigger, and to better understand the factors that can lead to disaster displacement becoming protracted. This is where our biggest blind spot still remains, and something that we continue to work on with our partners. So while we lack data on the cumulative numbers of people displaced worldwide as a result of disasters, that data does exist for conflict. And a total of 40 million people are now estimated to be living in internal displacement as a result of conflict and violence as of the end of 2017. 3/4 of the world's conflict IDPs are concentrated in just 10 countries. Of these, Syria, Colombia, Iraq, Sudan, and South Sudan have been among the 10 countries with the world's largest IDP populations in recent years. The persistence of large numbers of IDPs across the world reflects the intractability of conflict and crisis, notably in the Middle East and Africa. It also highlights the inability of governments to cope with and to recover from the impacts of displacement, particularly those that suffer high levels of new displacement each year, while already hosting some of the largest IDP caseloads in the world. This was the case in 2017 for Syria, DRC, Iraq, South Sudan, and Afghanistan. The majority of reported returns took place to and in countries with active armed conflict and unresolved displacement crises. And what our report shows this year is that of all the people reported as having returned, relocated, or locally integrated during the year, we estimate that around 8.5 million may not have found truly durable solutions and could still be displaced today. Now, if we actually counted these people, this would bring the global total to 48.5 million people currently living in internal displacement. Now, we've continued to outline in our report the main challenges that we face in painting a comprehensive global picture of internal displacement and measuring all the population movements, or what we call flows, in and out of displacement that would be needed to do this. Now, good IDP data is unfortunately still unavailable in many places in the world, particularly those where there's no humanitarian operation on the ground and no government capacity or willingness to collect it. We're still missing crucial data on secondary, tertiary, and repeated displacements, on cross-border movements, and on returns. We also struggle to obtain good quality disaggregated data on the sex, age, and disabilities of IDPs, on their exact location, needs, and vulnerabilities. In some countries, we're even having to rely on very old sources of data that may not reflect the true scale and nature of current displacement. Even though we've made progress in monitoring drought-related displacement this year, we're still not able to capture all displacement linked to slow onset hazards like sea level rise, ocean salinization, and desertification. We know, though, that these lead to a gradual loss of land and livelihoods, which can leave people and communities across the world with no other choice but to move. We need to work together with governments, with UN agencies and other stakeholders to close these gaps if we're to fully comprehend the scope of internal displacement and find effective ways of preventing and reducing it. So while getting better data is important, it's only part of the picture. In the second part of this year's report, we reflect on 20 years since the guiding principles were published. It's clear to us that despite progress and commitments by many countries and humanitarian and development actors, the pace of displacement continues to outstrip efforts to address it. The persistently high numbers of internally displaced people show that we need new approaches that go beyond looking at internal displacement as a purely humanitarian issue, responded to predominantly by humanitarian actors. Along with its tragic impacts on individuals and on communities, internal displacement also affects the development, the economic growth, and stability of states. Those states dealing with the issue should lead the way in finding more effective ways to address it. The solution needs to be adapted to national realities and needs to be locally owned. For this, internal displacement should become an integral part of countries' national development plans and strategies, and cross-sectoral approaches to better prevent and reduce this phenomenon should be developed. Failing to invest more consistently in peace building, disaster risk reduction, poverty reduction, and climate change adaptation will ultimately slow down countries' developments and global progress towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. It's the investments that we make today that will ultimately determine how successful we are in reducing the global numbers, preventing more people from becoming uprooted from their homes in the future, and finally turning the tide on this global crisis. IDMC is committed to supporting new approaches to this issue. We'll continue to expand the breadth of our global monitoring, and we'll continue to innovate in how we collect and analyze displacement data. We'll also expand our research to gain a better understanding of the economic impacts of internal displacement on people, on communities, and on countries. Our next global report next year will be focusing on the urban dimensions of internal displacement, looking at the scale, the nature, and the impact of displacement in cities and what can be done with countries and municipalities to find effective solutions to reduce the vulnerabilities of IDPs in cities. We'll build on the relationships we have with a wide network of partners across the world, and we will work closely with national governments to support them in developing new approaches to this issue. Now, it's my great pleasure to invite our 4 panelists to tell us about internal displacement in their country, to listen to their perspectives so that we can then discuss challenges but also opportunities that lie ahead. So let me join you on the panel.